At 9:42 a.m. on July 13, 1944, Sergeant Curtis "Grub" Culin watched General Omar Bradley step out of a jeep near Saint-Lô, knowing the next 30 seconds could decide whether 3,000 American tanks would ever break out of Normandy. Culin was 29 years old, had spent just 2 weeks testing his idea, and had exactly 0 official approval. For 6 weeks, First Army had lost more than 400 Sherman tanks trying to cross the Norman bocage. These weren't hedges, they were ancient earth walls, 12 feet high and 4 feet thick, hardened by centuries of roots and stone. French farmers had built them since medieval times, piling dirt and rocks along field lines until trees grew and the earth turned solid. When American tanks tried to climb over them, they exposed their 1-inch belly armor, and German Panzerfaust teams waited for that exact moment. Most Sherman crews burned before they could even escape. Culin's unit, the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron of the 2nd Armored Division, had been probing these hedgerows since June 20th, and the math was brutal. Each battalion had around 70 tanks, but only 4 bulldozer Shermans, which could push through hedges slowly while drawing enemy fire. After advancing just 8 miles inland since D-Day, thousands of hedgerows still blocked the road to open country. At that pace, it would take 6 months to move 20 miles. Operation Cobra, the planned breakout, would fail unless someone solved this problem. Engineers tried explosives, which barely cracked the walls and attracted artillery. Crews welded spare tracks to their hulls, which stopped bullets but not Panzerfausts fired from 10 yards. Others tried ramming hedges at full speed, only to bury their tanks nose first into 500-year-old roots. Culin took a different approach. He scavenged German beach obstacles called Czech hedgehogs, 3 steel beams welded into a jack shape that were meant to tear open landing craft. American engineers had cut thousands of them apart after D-Day. Culin took 4 sections of that steel, each 2 inches thick, and welded them to a tank's bow, angled forward at 35 degrees. Instead of climbing the hedge, the prongs would dig into its base. He tested it 7 times on a light tank, 7 successful breaches. Then came the real test, a full-weight Sherman, 33 tons of steel. If it failed, the prongs could rip off or the tank could flip forward. Lieutenant Charles Green volunteered his crew. On July 12th, the modified Sherman smashed through the hedge. Then it did it again and again. Word reached Bradley, who demanded a personal demonstration the next morning. He pointed to a massive hedgerow 200 yards away, the kind that had stopped American armor for 42 days. Green lined up 50 yards out. Ready to demonstrate hedge breach. Bradley raised his binoculars. Proceed. The Sherman accelerated to 25 miles per hour. The steel prongs hit the earth wall like a freight train. Dirt exploded. The tank pushed for 3 seconds against 5 centuries of compacted earth, and then burst through. 14 seconds later, it emerged intact on the other side. Bradley walked to the gap, touched the torn roots, then turned and asked, "How many of these can we make?" Culin answered, "About 500. Bradley replied, "I want 3,000. If you want to know whether Culin's beach trash invention actually worked in combat, hit like and subscribe, because what happens next is insane. Within hours, Bradley ordered every German beach obstacle stripped for steel and every available welder in Normandy put on 24-hour shifts. Every Sherman, light tank, and tank destroyer would get the cutter. Operation Cobra was 12 days away. That meant modifying 3,000 vehicles, 1 tank every 6 minutes. But when production began, nothing went smoothly. The hedgehog steel was harder than expected. Torches overheated. Welders burned through tips. On the first day, only 8 tanks were modified. At that rate, the war would be over before the job was done. And Culin had just 12 days to find out whether his invention would change the war or be completely useless once German guns opened fire.
Operation Cobra would launch without them if Culin failed. On July 15th, Culin tore apart the production line and found the real enemy wasn't time, it was heat. The German hedgehog steel absorbed thermal energy slower than American steel, causing torch tips to overheat and fail. Culin requisitioned additional cutting assemblies and reorganized the welders into rotation shifts, one team cutting while another cooled equipment. Production jumped to 22 devices that day, still nowhere near enough. Colonel Doctrine pulled 40 more welders from maintenance battalions across Normandy. By July 17th, output reached 38 cutters per day. The math was still brutal. 3,000 tanks, 38 per day, 79 days required. Cobra launched in 8 days. Then another problem surfaced. Each 4-prong cutter weighed 320 pounds. Bolted to a Sherman's bow, it shifted the center of gravity forward by 6 inches. The front suspension compressed. After repeated hedge impacts, several test tanks showed stress fractures in the suspension springs. If that failure happened in combat, the tank would die in place. Culin redesigned the mount overnight. Instead of bolting directly to the bow plate, he added reinforcement brackets that spread the load across the hull's structural frame. Installation time increased by 30 minutes, but suspension failure stopped. By July 19th, production hit 64 devices per day. Total completed, around 400. That left 2,600 tanks unmodified. Bradley's headquarters sent a priority message. The general demanded at least 2,000 Rhino tanks. Miss that number and Cobra might be delayed. Every day of delay meant more German reinforcements and more American deaths. Doctrine found more steel. Engineers had stockpiled additional Czech hedgehogs near Utah Beach. Transportation units hauled them inland on July 20th. Raw material was no longer the issue. Welding capacity was. Culin contacted maintenance units not assigned to Cobra's first wave. Tank recovery teams already had welders for battlefield repairs. He turned them into auxiliary production cells. 15 new welding stations came online July 21st. Production exploded to 112 devices per day. Welders worked through the night under floodlights powered by mobile generators. Sparks lit up the Norman fields like an industrial city dropped from the sky. Nobody slept more than 4 hours. By July 22nd, 3 days before Cobra, production hit 1,200 cutters. Doctrine calculated they could install another 850 before launch. Total, 2,050 Rhino tanks, barely over Bradley's minimum. Then the steel ran out. Every German beach obstacle between the beachhead and Cherbourg was gone. Engineers found another 300 hedgehogs scattered along minor exits, but transport units were busy moving fuel and ammunition. They wouldn't arrive in time. Doctrine needed another solution. Railroad track steel. Softer than German hedgehogs, but available in massive quantities. Several units had already experimented with it. Lieutenant Charles Green's 747th Tank Battalion had welded massive railroad prongs onto their Shermans. They called it the Green Dozer. Cruder, heavier, but it worked. The Ordnance Group shifted instantly. Hedgehog cutters where steel remained, railroad prongs for everyone else. July 23rd, 2 days before Cobra. Total completed, 1,800 Rhino tanks. Another 500 in progress using railroad steel. Final estimate, 2,300 modified tanks. 77% of Bradley's armor. Not perfect, but enough. On July 24th, the modified tanks rolled into forward assembly areas near Marigny. Culin walked between endless columns of Shermans, every bow fitted with steel prongs. They looked absurd, like prehistoric beasts armored for extinction-level combat. Cobra would begin at dawn, July 25th. 3,000 Allied aircraft, 4,000 tons of bombs. Then the armor would move, punching through hedgerows the Germans believed were invincible. Culin hadn't slept in 72 hours. His hands were burned raw from hot steel. But as he watched the tanks assemble, he realized what those prongs truly meant. Roughly 14,000 tank crewmen who might survive the breakout. Men who wouldn't die trapped in burning steel after exposing their bellies to German guns. Whether the invention worked would be decided in 9 hours. July 25th, 6:11 a.m. The ground near Saint-Lô shook
as 1,500 bombers dropped 4,000 tons of explosives. The bombardment lasted 90 minutes. When it stopped, the silence felt wrong. At 7:45 a.m., the first Rhino tanks entered the bocage. 2nd Armored led, 3rd Armored followed, 1st Infantry Division supported. Every tank carried Culin's cutter or a railroad variant. At 8:15 a.m., radio reports came in. Company B reached its first hedgerow. The lead Sherman accelerated to 25 miles per hour and hit the earth wall. The prongs dug in. 16 seconds later, the tank broke through. No damage. Company C breached 3 hedgerows in 20 minutes. Company A smashed through 5 consecutive lines without stopping. Across the front, tanks that normally took hours to advance one field were crossing multiple hedges in minutes. German defenses collapsed in real time. Their doctrine assumed tanks would climb and expose their belly armor. Panzerfaust teams aimed upward. Anti-tank guns covered predictable climb points. When the Rhinos punched straight through at ground level, every German firing solution became useless. By 10:30 a.m., 2nd Armored Division had advanced 2 miles, terrain that normally took 3 days to cross.
3rd Armored Division reported the same thing. The bocage defensive network was collapsing because its greatest strength, terrain, was gone. Hedgerows that had stopped tanks for 6 weeks were now just obstacles that delayed an advance by 15 seconds. But the Rhino devices weren't flawless. Around 11 a.m., failure reports began coming in. A Sherman from the 741st Tank Battalion hit a hedgerow with a buried stone foundation. The prongs bent backward on impact, locking the tank in place. It couldn't move forward or reverse. The crew bailed out under machine gun fire. 2 men were killed trying to escape. At 11:20 a.m., a light tank struck an iron fence post hidden in the hedge base. The prongs snapped off completely, tearing part of the bow plate with them. The tank remained combat capable, but could no longer breach hedges. At noon, a tank destroyer fitted with railroad prongs hit a hedgerow at 30 miles per hour, too fast. The mounting brackets buckled, the prongs twisted sideways and jammed the right track. The vehicle was immobilized. The failure rate stabilized at roughly 4%. 4 failed breaches out of every 100 attempts. Not catastrophic, but real. 4% of 2,300 tanks meant about 92 failures. 92 crews potentially exposed in open fields under German fire. Culin listened to the radio traffic from the observation post. Most reports were positive, armor advancing faster than at any point since D-Day. But the failures stayed in his head. 4%, 92 tanks, roughly 460 men. Then, at 1:30 p.m., a report changed everything. A battalion from 3rd Armored had reached the Marigny-Saint-Gilles road, 4 miles inland. 4 miles in 6 hours. The same distance had taken 2 weeks in June. By 3 p.m., advanced elements were 5 miles inland. German units were pulling back because they couldn't establish new defensive lines fast enough. The bocage, once their shield, had become meaningless. American armor was moving through it like open ground. At 4:15 p.m., Bradley's headquarters issued its assessment. Operation Cobra was exceeding all projections. The Rhino tanks had solved the bocage problem. Estimated German casualties were triple American losses. The stalemate was broken. Culin left the observation post at 5 p.m. and drove back toward the production field near Colombières. The welding stations were silent now. Every modified tank had moved forward. The field was empty except for scrap steel and burned-out torch tips. Culin sat on a jeep hood and tried to absorb it. 3 weeks earlier, it had been a sketch on a ration box. German beach steel welded onto tank bows. Now the entire Normandy front was moving because tanks no longer climbed hedges, they punched through them. The failure rate still bothered him. 4% meant the design wasn't perfect. Stone foundations, hidden fence posts, impact speed, variables he hadn't tested. 92 crews paid for those limits, but over 2,200 devices worked. About 14,000 men advanced through terrain that should have killed them. The math was ugly but clear. 4% failure was better than 60% losses from exposed belly armor. As the sun set, artillery thunder rolled from miles away. The front had moved 8 miles inland in a single day. The bocage was behind them. On July 26th, Bradley's headquarters authorized continued production. Advancing units were still encountering hedgerows deeper inside France. The devices remained useful. The Ordnance Group was cleared to build another 500 cutters using remaining railroad steel. By July 28th, total production reached 2,850 modified tanks, about 60% of First Army's armor. The rest were specialized vehicles or reserve units that couldn't mount the devices. Rhino tanks appeared everywhere. Second Armored used them from Saint-Lô to Coutances. Third Armored from Marigny to Avranches. First Infantry employed them during the Mortain counterattack. Fourth Armored received theirs on July 30th and drove them toward Brittany. Units adapted the design. The 747th preferred heavy railroad prongs. Second Armored standardized Culin's lighter hedgehog steel version. Tank destroyers used shortened 3-prong models to preserve gun traverse. Light tanks ran 2-prong versions to reduce weight. Maintenance units refined field repairs. Bent prongs were straightened with hydraulic jacks. Broken welds re-welded in 30 minutes. Completely destroyed devices replaced in 2 hours if spare prongs were available. The Colombière site became a repair depot, recycling damaged cutters back into combat. The impact went beyond breaching hedges. German units retreated faster because they couldn't anchor defenses. Panzer divisions pulled back toward the Seine. American armor advanced 40 miles in 8 days. The Falaise pocket formed because German forces couldn't maneuver through bocage to escape. Rhino tanks blocked retreat routes. Intelligence reports from captured German officers told the other side of the story. They called the devices iron tusks and hedge devils. Several prisoners said they abandoned positions once they realized American tanks could breach any hedgerow. One German commander admitted his anti-tank crew fled after watching 3 Shermans punch through what they believed were impregnable earth walls. By August 5th, the bocage campaign was effectively over. American forces were in open country. A problem that had stopped them for 6 weeks was solved in 12 days. Bradley's staff later calculated the Rhino devices accelerated the Normandy breakout by 4 to 6 weeks. The numbers weren't dramatic. They were decisive. Between July 25th and August 10th, American tank casualties dropped by 37% compared to June and early July. That translated to roughly 300 tanks not destroyed and about 1,500 crewmen not killed or wounded. Against that, the 4% device failure rate was statistically negligible. As American armor pushed beyond Normandy into open terrain, not every unit kept the cutters. The 4-pronged assemblies weighed 320 pounds, reducing top road speed and increasing fuel consumption. By mid-August, around 40% of Rhino tanks had removed their devices. Others kept them. 4th Armored Division retained theirs through September, encountering scattered hedgerows in eastern France. 2nd Armored stored removed prongs on supply trucks in case reinstallation was needed. Several tank destroyer battalions kept lighter variants permanently mounted. The cutters were still in use on September 2nd when American forces liberated Paris. A few Rhino tanks even rolled in the Liberation Parade, their steel prongs still welded to the bow. French civilians didn't know what those strange metal tusks meant. American tankers did. They meant the difference between dying in a Norman field and reaching Paris alive. Culin watched the advance from Normandy. Bradley's staff reassigned him to training duty, teaching replacement crews how to breach hedgerows. Throughout August, he demonstrated Rhino tactics at a training ground near Evra. On August 15th, a courier arrived with orders from Bradley's headquarters. The general wanted to see him immediately. No explanation. Culin drove to headquarters expecting questions about failures. 4%, 92 disabled tanks. Maybe command wanted answers. He arrived at 1700 hours and reported in. Bradley was waiting with senior staff. A folder with official letterhead lay on the desk. Culin realized instantly this wasn't about failure. Bradley motioned him to sit, opened the folder, and slid a document across the desk. It was a recommendation for the Legion of Merit, signed by Bradley and co-signed by Major General Leonard Giroux. "You're being awarded the Legion of Merit for exceptionally meritorious conduct," Bradley said. He continued, "Your hedge-cutting device directly contributed to the success of Operation Cobra and saved an estimated 1,500 American lives." Culin stared at the paper. The Legion of Merit was the fourth highest U.S. military decoration. It was awarded for campaign-level impact. Sergeants almost never received it. "Sir, I just welded some steel to tanks." Bradley replied, "You solved a tactical problem that stopped First Army for 6 weeks. Every tank commander from here to Paris knows your name. The device is officially designated the Culin hedge cutting device in Army records. You earned this." The ceremony took place on August 20th in a field near Saint-Lô. Bradley personally pinned the medal to Cullen's uniform. Around 200 officers and enlisted men attended. Several tank commanders whose crews survived because of the devices were present. Lieutenant Charles Green from the 747th Tank Battalion was there. During Cobra, he'd breached 47 hedgerows without losing a single crewman. The citation credited Culin with exceptional ingenuity and technical skill in overcoming formidable terrain obstacles and enabling the Allied breakout from Normandy. It cited the production of 2,850 devices and the estimated casualty reduction. News spread across Allied forces. British armored units requested technical specifications. The British 21st Army Group produced around 300 similar devices, calling them prongs instead of rhinos. Canadian armored divisions built roughly 200 using salvaged German steel from their own beach sectors. Technical drawings were shared with the Soviet Union through Lend-Lease channels, but the Red Army never adopted the design. Soviet doctrine favored overwhelming firepower over terrain adaptation. They solved bocage-style problems by erasing obstacles with artillery. By September, the Culin device appeared in U.S. training manuals. Fort Knox added hedgerow breaching techniques to its armored curriculum. New crews learned the doctrine: approach at 25 miles per hour, strike the hedge base, maintain forward momentum for 15 seconds, clear the opposite side, continue the advance. Field modifications continued through autumn 1944. Some crews added steel teeth for better penetration. Others welded deflector plates to prevent snagging on buried obstacles. A few even built folding versions that could be raised when not needed. After Normandy, the devices saw limited use. The terrain didn't demand them. By October, most units had removed and stored their prongs. Occasional hedgerows in Belgium and Germany were handled with dozers or infantry explosives. But the lesson remained. Improvised solutions using battlefield scrap could break problems that stopped entire armies. Senior officers began encouraging similar innovation. When American forces encountered dragon's teeth anti-tank obstacles in Germany, engineers improvised ramps from rubble and steel beams. The precedent came from Culin's beach obstacle invention. Culin returned to the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron on August 25th. His unit advanced through northern France towards Belgium. He went back to being a cavalry sergeant. No special assignment, no headquarters job, just reconnaissance patrols. He fought through September and October, crossed into Germany in November. The Rhino tanks faded from attention as new problems replaced old ones. The bocage was hundreds of miles behind the front. In April 1945, the 102nd Cavalry reached the Elbe River. Germany surrendered on May 8th. Culin had spent 3 years in combat. He was 30 years old. The war was over. He returned to the United States in June 1945 and received his discharge papers. The Legion of Merit was listed on his record. So was his role in developing the hedge cutter. But civilian life didn't care about battlefield innovation. Medals didn't pay rent. Culin needed a job. What happened after Culin returned home would decide whether his contribution vanished into history or became something remembered. He returned to Cranford, New Jersey in July 1945 and married Bernice Enright that September. They moved to New York City, where Culin took a job with Schenley Industries, a liquor company. It had nothing to do with tanks, engineering, or the war. Just steady civilian work for a man trying to rebuild a normal life. The hedge cutter story followed him quietly. Local newspapers ran pieces about the Cranford sergeant who helped break the Normandy stalemate. The Cranford Citizen and Chronicle published a feature on September 7, 1944, while Culin was still overseas, describing how he showed the idea to his officers and how General Bradley called it revolutionary. But nationally, attention moved on. The war rolled forward. Atomic bombs, victory in Europe, victory in Japan. A tank modification from July 1944 became a footnote. That changed in 1951 when Bradley published his memoir, A Soldier's Story. Bradley described the bocage problem in detail and credited Culin by name, writing that the solution was so absurdly simple it baffled an army for more than 5 weeks. He recalled watching the July 13th demonstration and realizing the stalemate was over. Military historians took notice. The Army's official history of the European theater in 1953 devoted multiple paragraphs to the hedge cutters and their role in Operation Cobra. Still, Culin himself remained largely unknown outside professional military circles. He stayed with Schenley Industries through the 1950s, lived quietly in New York City, and avoided publicity. He joined the Sons of the American Revolution, tracing his lineage to Colonel Curtis Grubb of the Revolutionary War. No lectures, no interviews, just a normal life. But the idea he introduced endured. Army field manuals were revised to emphasize improvisation and the use of available materials. Officers were trained to listen to enlisted personnel rather than wait for official equipment. The idea that a sergeant could solve a strategic problem became doctrine. NATO forces adopted similar thinking. British, Canadian, and French armies formalized field modification protocols. Even the Soviet Union, despite rejecting the hedge cutter itself, began allowing more tactical flexibility at lower command levels. Most of the physical devices disappeared. A few Rhino tanks survived in museums. Fort Knox preserved a Sherman with original prongs. The National World War II Museum later displayed a similar vehicle. The rest were scrapped or lost. But the engineering lesson lived on. Modern combat engineers study the hedge cutter as a case study in rapid battlefield adaptation. The idea of repurposing enemy obstacles became standard practice, later echoed in counter-IED efforts in Iraq and Afghanistan. Culin died on November 20, 1963, in Greenwich Village, Manhattan. He was 48 years old. His obituary mentioned the Legion of Merit and the hedge cutter, briefly. Then something unexpected happened. In June 1964, President Dwight Eisenhower gave a televised interview marking the 20th anniversary of D-Day. Asked about the bocage problem, Eisenhower told the hedge cutter story. He named Culin directly and explained how the device changed the campaign. The interview aired nationwide on June 6th. Millions watched. Eisenhower stood in an actual Normandy field near Saint-Lô, the hedgerows still towering behind him, and explained how one sergeant from New Jersey solved a problem that stopped an army. Culin wasn't alive to see it, but his contribution finally entered public memory. Official recognition had actually begun much earlier. On July 28, 1944, First Army issued Technical Bulletin TBR-231, formally designating the invention as the hedge-cutting device M1 Culin type. Installation specs, tactical employment, and maintenance procedures were standardized. What began as a 3-day field modification became official equipment in 3 weeks. Third Army adopted the device on August 1st. Patton's forces received around 500 cutters for their dash across France. After-action reports credited them with rapid movement through scattered bocage in Brittany and eastern France. Ninth Army produced another 200 using salvaged German steel. British engineers visited the Colombière production site and created their own prong device Mark I. Canadian forces developed obstacle cutter improvised Type A. SHAEF issued a commendation on August 15th, praising enlisted innovation, distributing it across all Allied armies. Operational research completed in September confirmed the impact. Tank losses dropped from 8.3% per engagement to 4.7%. Crew casualties fell 37%. Time required to cross bocage terrain dropped by 73%. The economics were just as clear. Each destroyed Sherman cost roughly $63,000 in 1944 dollars. Each hedge cutter cost about $40 in scrap steel and 12 man-hours of labor. During Cobra alone, the devices saved an estimated 300 tanks, nearly $19 million in equipment, not counting trained crews. The Armored Force Board at Fort Knox reviewed the data in October 1944 and concluded the device represented one of the most cost-effective battlefield innovations of the war. A solution born from scrap metal, welded by a sergeant, had changed the course of a campaign and proved that sometimes the most important weapon isn't invented in a factory, but in a muddy field by someone who refuses to accept that a problem has no answer.
Their report recommended adding hedgerow breaching with improvised cutters into basic tank crew training, and by November it became standard. Every American tank crew trained after that learned Culin's technique, and in December 1944, Field Manual FM 17-33 was updated with a full chapter on obstacle breaching, complete with diagrams for prong installation, step-by-step breach procedures, and field repair guidance, spreading the doctrine far beyond armored units as combat engineers began teaching how to turn enemy obstacles into raw materials. Infantry officers learned to identify breach points for supporting armor, artillery observers trained to coordinate fires during hedgerow assaults, and the long-term impact carried straight into the Cold War as NATO forces studying a potential fight in Central Europe analyzed the bocage campaign in detail, while even Warsaw Pact doctrine anticipated similar improvised breaching, and Soviet military journals of the 1950s cited the Culin device as proof of Western battlefield adaptability. With the U.S. Army's Combat Studies Institute using the hedgerow cutter as a case study from 1953 onward, West Point cadets analyzing the decision-making that led to its adoption, enlisted leadership courses teaching that solutions could come from any rank with initiative, and by 1960, the innovation appearing in 16 different NATO training curricula with over 50,000 soldiers studying what began as a sergeant's sketch, institutionalizing the idea that one person could change a campaign. Yet Curtis Culin himself never taught those classes, never saw the manuals that carried his name. worked quietly at Schenley Industries in New York, and died in 1963, 18 months before Eisenhower publicly credited him, leaving the question of whether his contribution would fade into obscurity, though today his legacy lives in three places: museums, Doctrine, and the memories of veterans who survived because 4 steel prongs were welded to tank bows, including an M4 Sherman with original Culin hedgerow cutters at Fort Knox, seen by about 30,000 visitors a year, a similar Sherman at the National WWII Museum in New Orleans, with photos from the Columbia production line and Bradley's mass production orders, interactive exhibits explaining the engineering behind the prongs, and even recovered cutters displayed in Normandy near Saint-Lô, often overlooked by tourists but instantly recognized by American veterans. Yet the true legacy isn't in museums but in doctrine, the principle that strategic problems can be solved with available materials, tactical initiative, and 15 seconds of courage, a lesson that echoed in Iraq when soldiers welded scrap metal onto Humvees, in Afghanistan when engineers modified vehicles in the field, and every time troops solved problems without waiting for perfect equipment, while Cullen's grave in New Jersey mentions his service and Legion of Merit, but not the hedgerow cutter, even though 1,500 men came home from Normandy because of it, men who had children and grandchildren, making the number of lives touched incalculable. Thousands, maybe tens of thousands, something Culin never knew, as he lived quietly, sought no recognition, wrote no memoirs, and gave no interviews, just a sergeant from Cranford who saw a problem and fixed it. And when the last surviving member of the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron died in 2019, he recalled watching the first breach and realizing they'd survive Normandy, because that's the real legacy, not medals or manuals, but lives saved, families reunited, and a war changed by scrap steel, courage, and imagination. So if this story moved you, hit like so YouTube shows it to more people, subscribe and turn on notifications because we rescue forgotten stories every week. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from and whether someone in your family served, because you're not just a viewer, you're helping make sure Curtis Culin doesn't disappear into silence.